For years, as a second home, the Silicon Valley has been fostering some of India's brightest minds, their technological talents, and their world-changing ideas. Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella, Jayashree Ulal, and Anjali Sood are among the growing list of Indian-origin CEOs of America's global corporate giants. When it comes to startups, a recent Stanford study shows that 90 founders among the 500 unicorns in the US were born in India. Notably, in recent years, the echo between the startup ecosystems in the US and India has become louder, with the Valley now doubling up as a launchpad for the rocket ship of Indian startups that are building in India for the world. Moreover, the Valley's interest in the world's third largest startup ecosystem is peaking not only as a leading destination for venture capital investing, but also as a hub of models that are fine examples for the emerging world. In this Young Turk special, Rangaswami, long-time angel investor and the founder of Indiaspora, a network of Indian-origin leaders who seek to be a force to catalyze social change, joins our panel to offer a global perspective on India's startup economy. Krithiga Reddy, who was SoftBank's first female investing partner and Facebook's first employee in India, is setting many more firsts. In a first-of-its-kind initiative, the president of Athena SPACs is helping women founders list their high-growth startups on the stock exchanges in the US. Saket Modi is the founder of Safe Security, which is famous for assessing the cybersecurity risk for India's UPI network. Shifting base to the Valley has proven beneficial for the Indian startup, with several Fortune 500 companies now in its clientele, including Google and Facebook. On an average every day, Safe Security helps mitigate more than 6,000 cyber attacks.
MR, 20 years for the show, but 40 years for you in the Valley, and of trying to draw the link between India and the US and these two ecosystems. A lot has changed. In fact, in the past 10 years, dramatic changes. What would you think have been the key milestones, especially in the past few years?
Yeah, so I think it's been a tremendous journey for the Indian community here. You know, when I came in '82, there were 10,000 of us, mainly in development and programming of chips and so forth. Fast forward, now we have CEOs of major tech companies. We have venture capitalists. We have people who do everything in the ecosystem of the technology industry. 40 years has been a dramatic run. I think every 10 years there have been shifts, but the biggest shift has come in the past 10 years when there have been CEOs of companies like Google, or you've seen venture capitalists like Vinod Khosla and others, and all the startups that have come from India as well over the past decade. And you'll hear from Saket
yes.
here, who's come over from India, one of them, right? And next week, for example, we have an event. We got over 100 CEOs who moved from India to Silicon Valley.
Well, yes, there are many who have moved from India to Silicon Valley, and that connection is certainly getting deeper every day as more and more Indian startups try and address global markets and position themselves as global companies. But Krithiga, I'm speaking to you now in your avatar as someone who is trying to support women-led businesses, and it's about time that we see more of that happen. But I want to ask you, Krithiga, from the time of being employee number one at Facebook in India to your time at SoftBank and now at Athena, what have been the big differences, the changes that you've seen in the ecosystem as it's evolved?
Shireen, once such a joy to be here, and congratulations on 20 years of Young Turks. I still remember that middle phase and that inflection point that we all saw as the country was going mobile and digital. And if I think about inflection points, I remember getting a group of entrepreneurs and tech CEOs together, digital tech CEOs together in India, and we were probably about a handful at that time. And if you think about this is just in about a decade, if you think about where we were then to now, where many of these entrepreneurs who had ideas at the back of the napkin are now taking their companies public. They're now on to their second venture. They're now into venture investing. It is just tremendous to see how much has changed in a decade. And coming to women, I think that's the one stat that I wish we had seen more change. And it's the one stat that I think we need to really focus on. And I hope when we talk a decade from now and we celebrate 30 years of Young Turk, we are talking about women being more closer to that 50-50 versus even in the US, we are talking about 11% of seed funding going to female founders. That needs to change, and I'm committed in my current avatar to leading the charge and helping more women in finance, more women in cap tables, more women founders.
Well, more power to you, and you're absolutely right. I think a lot more needs to be done. This has to be an issue that is prioritized. But Saket, you've been on the show many years ago. You debuted on mainstream media on Young Turks. So it's great to see you here in the Valley. And so much has changed for you, not just the name of the company. Lucidius is not Lucidius anymore, but the global aspiration.
Absolutely. Shireen, first of all, absolutely an honor to be here with you on the show. I have a special connection for Young Turks, so I cannot be happier and excited to be here with you on this occasion. A lot has changed very clearly, and as Charles Darwin says, it's not the strongest, but the most adaptable which survive. And I think that's really the case with what I see with most startups, including us. I think the big change that I saw, because we used to be an Indian services company. We've been on shows with you so many times. We did reasonably well, where, starting from securing UPI, Aadhaar, Google, Facebook, some of the largest customers on the planet on the services side of the business. But we taking a call that it's really not scalable, because unfortunately, that's the nature of services. And that's the reason how do you go from being services into product is the big change which I saw when I landed in the Silicon Valley. I was extremely fortunate to be mentored by some of the best on the planet when it comes to building products, when it comes to building global scale companies. And I think there's a little bit of bias when you are in India. I see, unfortunately, the smartest of the people with the smartest of the ideas generally get the ceiling of saying we'll do a services company. It's almost like a natural step one when you're out of college, you want to do things. I think it has some merits because you're very close to your customer, you can learn a lot, but unfortunately services doesn't scale up. You look at any of the top hundreds of tech companies on the planet, none of them are services companies. So that was a big change for us, and really the mindset of building a services company versus a product, a SaaS company, it's day and night different. And when I landed here 3.5 years back, I actually could feel that change. I'm obviously very fortunate that we've been able to make that transition reasonably well, and we're thriving despite all the turbulence in the global markets which are going on. And probably it's also the space, because cybersecurity is a good place to be. But yeah, that's the transition, big transition that I saw, Shireen. The services mindset to product SaaS mindset, it really makes the biggest of the difference, because you give the same number of hours, but the output is very different in terms of the impact you can create.
And that's absolutely right, Samar. That's what I want to talk to you about. What Saket mentioned there, and I was talking to another, or now considered the poster boy of Indian SaaS, Girish Mathubutham of Freshworks, and he said that despite all of the challenges, he believes that this is going to be the decade for product companies from India trying to go global. What do you believe has created this inflection point that's made it easier for people like Saket to be able to capture this opportunity?
I think the first point Saket mentioned is the transition from services to product. I think that's happening in India as we speak. The bigger thing I would argue is the ecosystem that's here in Silicon Valley. Like I mentioned, next week there are going to be 100 enterprise SaaS CEOs from India who all made Silicon Valley their home. And they're getting mentorship, advice, capital, customers, all from both the Indian-American ecosystem, but also from Fortune 500 companies where there are lots of Indians in positions of CIO and CTO, welcoming them into these companies as well. So I think it's a virtuous cycle that's happened with the diaspora landing here. Like I said, 10,000 people in '82 when I came, 300,000 Indian Americans in the Valley today. Just think of that scale of growth that has happened in the community and with the tech community itself.
Yeah, absolutely. But Krithiga, I want to address the tumultuous times that Saket alluded to, and it is getting difficult, both from a liquidity standpoint, and interest rates are moving higher. Every day we see VCs writing out new notes to their portfolio companies saying, look, prioritize, redeploy capital, hunker down, so on and so forth. You've seen these cycles play themselves out. What do you make of the one that we're currently in?
Shireen, I think it's important to look at the overall macro environment. If you think about the period that we have come from, we are coming from a period of low interest rates and countries pouring capital for COVID and other reasons, and there is a direct correlation in what happens and the exuberance that you see in the equity markets when you see that happen. So there is that natural correction as those factors shift, which means that there is a rebalance of capital going into equity as well as debt instruments. From a venture capitalist perspective, if you think about investing in an era of constraints versus an era of abundance, era of constraints is a great time to to invest. Some of the best companies were created in a downturn, whether it's Microsoft, Airbnb, Warby Parker, to give very different examples in very different industries. So that's from the VC perspective. I would also say from an entrepreneur perspective, there's never been a better time than to start companies in downturn. If you can build and thrive in this environment, you are so well positioned when the tides change. The only other thought that I'll share is, of course, there's an existing portfolio as well, and what happens to the companies that you might have invested at the high. We saw that period of uncertainty even when COVID hit, and that was a time as investors to over-index on how much time we were spending with portfolio companies versus new investments, as we really helped them think through strategies. Crisis has a way to accelerate strengths and weaknesses. So the ones that are market leaders, it's their opportunity to actually increase the lead. There are M&A opportunities, you get that at a better price. Unfortunately, the weaknesses also accelerate. So I do think we will see companies figuring out that the business model doesn't work. And there, I think the thought that all of us should keep in mind is that there are people behind these decisions.
Yeah.
So let's treat them with care. And for the companies in the middle, which will be the majority, again, it's time to make some pretty bold moves. Prioritize and see if you're doing 5 things, is there a way to hunker down and do 2 things really well? I remember, Shireen, when I joined the board of WeWork as part of the business turnaround, we came into an approved 5-year strategic plan to get back to profitability. And Sandeep, the CEO, came in and he said, I'm going to accelerate that transition and he took pretty bold moves in terms of how much costs he cut and how much he focused on the core business. And that kept the company in really good standing as COVID hit. And now it is on a path, publicly shared from examples like that, to make some pretty bold moves during these tumultuous times.
From a policy point of view, is there anything more that needs to be done to ensure that both of these ecosystems can collaborate, converge, and do stuff much more closely? Anything left on the policy front that needs addressing?
Yeah, I think so. For example, in India, all these companies that have moved to the US have reincorporated in Delaware. So the wealth is moving out of India, and I don't know if it'll ever come back. Because if you reincorporate and all your shares are in dollars, what happens when you have an exit? So I think that's a challenge that the Indian government has to address in some way. If not, a lot of the wealth being created by all these companies is moving out of India. That's, I think, one of the big things that the government needs to address, I think, in the short term. If they want to protect the capital, even though they have all these engineers in India, if they have the stock options in dollars, they don't have to bring it back, right? They could start investing it in companies here. So I think that's one of the things. There are also still some things from the angel tax and issues that still need to be fixed in India. I think the other one is in the crypto space.
Yeah.
Is crypto legal or illegal and all this? We went to Dubai. We took an Indiaspora delegation to Dubai.
Yeah, they're welcoming all things crypto.
Yeah, crypto, and everyone we met was an Indian who had left India, right? So these are some of the challenges still the country needs to address.
संडे हो या मंडे, जियो मार्ट पर सामान मिले सबसे सस्ता एवरीडे। जियो मार्ट, हर घर का मार्ट।
Krithiga, and I go back to your avatar at Facebook because the debate and the conversation rages on the dark side of big tech. And how much can you regulate, and what exactly do you regulate, and who regulates? I mean, these are questions that are still being grappled with by governments, policymakers, regulators around the world. As now an outsider who's been an insider, looking at this, how do you feel about it?
So I think that regulation has not kept pace, and I think I watched the first Senate hearing year right after Cambridge Analytica, and some of the questions that the senators asked where honestly, I felt horrified as far as the level of understanding of technology. Of course, we have come a long way since then, but really making sure that we are understanding the technology, its promise, its potential, and where it can be regulated. I do think we need to move faster, Shireen. And let's also not throw the baby out with the bathwater. One of my favorite Facebook India stories is when the founder of Maskalandar came to me and said, Krithiga, many of my cooks, they don't know how to read, they don't know how to write, but they know how to use a phone and they know how to use Facebook. So to just look at examples like that where social enable you to transcend literacy barriers and connect is tremendous. And there are just so many examples of how people, businesses, economy, society has been transformed.
Yeah. Saket, I want to address the issue of the future now with you, and given the opportunities that you see. And, speaking of bad actors and dark sides, I mean, that's your job, right? That's your day job, that's your night job, that's what you do for tea. So
just on the record, my job is to protect from the bad guys, just for the record. But yeah, you're right, Shireen. It's an exciting time because the rate of digitization has never been higher. I like this saying that CEO of PayPal said we went from Flintstones to Jetsons in 9 months because of the pandemic, and very rightly so, because despite any vertical you would look at, everything's digitized today, and almost in a biased way, I'd like to think that it's almost next to impossible to survive today, irrespective of the industry you're at, especially if you're a large company, if you're not digitally enabled. When that happens, obviously security to digital becomes a fundamental problem, and that's the reason why World Economic Forum putting cybersecurity as among the top 3 concerns in the boardrooms today, till all the way down till SEC guidelines, or in India, various guidelines coming in from RBI saying that you have to go ahead and look for cybersecurity, which is now a fiduciary responsibility for anybody sitting on the board. That's all positive, and in fact, it ties back because regulation for consumer tech companies is almost corollary to SEC guidelines and RBI guidelines to companies' boards, because then you were saying that when your business is becoming the data that you're acquiring from your customers, you're responsible for its security. And unfortunately, we see a lot of issues happening on those lines. So again, I don't mean to scare people, but the speed at which cyber crimes happening has never been higher. In the last 30 days, we've actually seen more attacks than what we saw arguably in the last 3 months.
In the last 30 days?
Yes, in the last 30 days.
What's changed in the last 30 days?
Well, it has a lot to do starting from the Ukraine war, which was out there, and there was almost forces on both sides, and the whole world trying to support Ukraine, and Russia actually saw a lot of hacks that happened starting from their media publications, etc., till a lot of stuff which is also built up, it looks like, for a couple of major initiatives, because when the markets go down, what happens in that side is everybody is going to almost like a survival mode.
Yeah.
That is the time where you impact and you ask for ransom. Nobody wants to go to the regulator. Nobody wants a reputational hit. When your stock's already down by 30, 40, 50%, the last thing you want is come out with a press release saying that, oh, all my customer data went to the public, because it can almost be survival.
Ransomware has seen a spike?
Ransomware on one side has actually come down because Russia actually took a lot of action on ransomware actors, and they actually went, this is a very interesting one, they actually live telecasted on YouTube the most famous ransomware group. It was called R-Evil, and they actually live telecasted the takedown because they used to be in a hotel in Russia. Okay. So Russian authorities went in, and people can see it online. But ransomware is down, but it's not just ransomware. I'm talking about actual data hacking.
Right.
That is rising because if a hacker steals your data, you're almost obligated now to tell to your customers, to your shareholders,
Correct.
and that can really be a big hammering to your stock prices. And that's the reason why we see different types of attacks and not ransomware. And that's the reason why it's more important than ever to really know your cybersecurity in a very objective, quantified way, which today is missing.
Okay. Well, speaking of what's missing, and I want to ask you, in terms of what the road ahead looks like, you've been working on bringing these ecosystems together for the last several years, Naimar. What's going to be on the priority list going forward?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, I think Krithiga mentioned women. We need to see more women in tech become CEOs. There have been few recently, like Yamini Rangan at HubSpot getting the CEO job and so forth. We need to see many more of that come into play. The other thing would be, taking the rules of Silicon Valley and maybe implementing that in India. I know Gift City in India has implemented a different set of rules. Why not take that kind of approach? And you can see the other thing, there are direct flights from San Francisco to Bangalore. So this is only going to get closer. Why not adopt some of the rules and regulations that comply, that protects both India and the US? So I see a lot of changes that can happen.
Krithiga, speaking of women, and I want to talk to you about what you're doing at Athena and trying to support, nurture, back women-led businesses. Where do you find yourself in that journey? And specifically as now an investor and in your avatar at SoftBank, where you were the first woman investment manager, so to speak, why is it so hard for women to break through, for women to be able to access the capital that's required? And what will it take to make that change?
When Athena started, we noticed that less than 3% of SPAC management teams had C-level women in their management teams. And so Athena started and became a platform for female-led SPACs. And within a short time of a year, we have had the first African-American woman ring the New York Stock Exchange IPO opening bell. Then when I rang the IPO opening bell for Athena Technology too, we were the first all-female, all-immigrant team. So change can happen, and so I'm encouraged and optimistic, and that's the core of what I am, and I think we need to take big strides to get there. And Shireen, just one other point that I wanted to make on your earlier question of what can leaders do. I mean, we spoke about the regulation side, but I also wanted to make sure, like every tech leader has that responsibility to address that dark side proactively. And I also have a big investment thesis around the use of AI and technology for good. And there are so many examples of how AI is being used to tackle diversity biases, or there's diversity training using AR, VR that lets you be in quote unquote the skin of the other person, that lets that message sink in much deeper. So there's a whole variety of applications where you can really use technology and AI for good, and that's something that I really look forward to seeing more.
Well, you talked about change. This is what change can look like, should look like, and hopefully we will see much more of it. Let me get wrap-up comments from each of you. And Saket, I'll start by asking you, I would imagine that that you're also going to be reviewing all of your priorities as you prepare for what is likely to be a fairly difficult time. Any changes that we're likely to see?
As we all said, right, hunker down and focus on customers. That's really the focus, Shireen. And I think that's the time when you surround yourself with the right people. In fact, one comment I want to make, because a lot of people, especially in India, when they'll be listening to this, right, like MR spoke about Yamini taking up the CEO of HubSpot job. For me, all the new CEOs, whether it's Satya Nadella, whether it's Sundar Pichai, for me, they're still lagging indicators. The lead indicator, what most people don't realize, HubSpot was actually Dharmesh Shah, who is the CTO and founder, and he's one of the co-founder, and he's one of the key guys. If you look at, say, Berkshire Hathaway, while we know Warren Buffett, it's really Ajit Jain. Yeah. If you look at Google, it's actually Motwani sir, who had his students, which were Sergey and Larry, which went ahead and created Google. And there are 100 such examples. For me, there's a much bigger ecosystem out here of Indians which have really made an impact to getting the Silicon Valley to where it is. That for me is the leading indicator. And now we're looking at a few sprouts which come out as CEOs, but it's so much more which is happening. And if somebody wants to create a product company, it's India and US have never been more stronger in terms of relationships. And it's such a great place to actually have one leg in India and one leg in the US and really dominate the world.
Well, more power to you as well. MR, priorities for the year ahead?
Yeah, I think it's harnessing the power of the ecosystem. And so, for example, in the Fortune 500, Indiaspora has listed 60 CEOs are Indian. Same thing with CIOs and CTOs in the Fortune 500, over 100 CIOs and CTOs. How can we enable this whole ecosystem to help each other?
Perfect. And a book coming out, Krithiga.
A book coming out, and it actually centers on my journey of building Facebook India. And of course, I draw off my experiences before and after. This is a time where we're seeing technology change in so many different areas, whether it's AI, data, Web3, IoT. That's on one hand. On the other hand, the problems the world is seeing has never been more complex. How is it that we can harness the power of technology to solve the challenges of today and tomorrow? And how is it that we can shift the bar in terms of diversity, not just women, but all kinds of diversity, Shireen?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Shireen.
Yes.
I've probably been on 30 to 40 shows with you, and I've never done this. Yeah. I really want to interrupt you right now.
Okay, fine.
And yeah, I will take that liberty of doing that. Because most people who are watching the show and who've been seeing you for so many years think of you as a journalist.
Yeah.
I actually want to show them a very different view.
Okay.
20 years of a franchisee, as a founder, being at the helm and running that, is not the job of only a journalist, but it's a journalist and an entrepreneur. In my view, I think we need a round of applause for you, because
very
Shireen,
kind.
running that entire thing for 20 years is so important, and I know how difficult it is, because it's not just what they see on the camera, it's so much that goes behind the scenes. And I really want to take a moment to thank you, because I don't know one journalist in the entire journalism community in India which has made an impact the way you have to the startup ecosystem.
That's very,
So
very sweet
thank
of
you so
Saket.
much
Thank
for
you so
everything
much.
you do.
It's been one of the most gratifying things that I've done. We've had the most fabulous team that I've worked with over the years, as you know. And as I said, the idea when we started it 20 years ago was really to expand the people who were on the channel. We said, let's try and find young people. I thought it would be over in 13 weeks and that would be the end of the story, but it's taken on a life of its own, and I'm so glad to have been part of this journey and have seen the Indian startup ecosystem evolve over the years. So thank you very much for that. That was lovely. Thank you, Krithiga. Thank you, MR, for joining us here in the Valley. We wish you all the very best of luck. Well, that's it then on this edition of Voices from the Valley. From all of us here on the show, goodbye. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again shortly. For now, goodbye.